Okay, good evening, everyone, or good morning, afternoon, depending where you are. Thank you for joining us for the last of this series that I've been doing over the last 4 weeks, where we have a very special guest with us who I'll introduce a little bit later. But I think most of you on the call know at least something about Dan Meridor. I'll introduce him properly later. Today's discussion is going to be in two parts. Dan Meridor is going to speak second, and he's going to speak about more specifically about liberal nationalism, the idea of liberal nationalism in the context of Menachem Begin and Israel and Zionism. What I'm going to do first is talk about the application of liberal nationalism today, based on an essay that I wrote a few months ago that came out of a seminar we had here at the Begin Center on liberal nationalism, which was eventually published in an American journal called The American Interest back in February. I'm actually very pleased to have Dan Meridor on this talk with me, because he was something of a mentor to me during the final drafting of that essay. There's a lot I could say. It's quite a long essay. I've written a link to the essay in the chat box if you want to look at it later. I'm not going to cover it all now because it would go on for too long, and I only want to speak for about 15 minutes so that you're not waiting too long for Dan Meridor. So I'm going to get to that now. I'll just say, for any of you who've not been on one of these meetings before, we take questions at the end after I've spoken and after Dan Meridor has spoken, and you can write questions in the chat box, and we'll get to them at the end. Okay, as I said, I'm going to keep this to 15 minutes, so you're not waiting too long to hear from our guest speaker. Liberal nationalism. What is it, or what do I mean by it at least, and how can it be applied to solve or help to solve a crisis, a contemporary crisis facing democracies today in the West? Firstly, what crisis am I talking about? Specifically, I'm referring to the rise of populist nationalist leaders in democratic countries in Europe and elsewhere. There's been a number of books and articles written about it, and it's with some very apocalyptic titles like The End of Democracy or The Death of Democracy. So it's certainly taken seriously by a number of political scientists. I'll just give you one quote from one observer, Princeton University's Jan Werner Müller, who's talking about Europe, and he says, "It's hard to avoid the feeling that Central Europe is living 1989 in reverse. In that year, peaceful revolutions in the name of liberal democracy spread from one communist country to another. Today, we witness the emergence of a new authoritarian international in the region." Now, he's talking specifically, of course, about former communist countries that embraced democracy after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now appear to be backtracking, most notably Hungary and Poland. But it's not just in former communist countries that we can see this trend. Across Europe, what we used to call far-right parties are becoming part of the mainstream. In places like Italy and Austria, they were even part of the coalition governments until quite recently. Le Front National in France made it to the second round of the last French presidential elections. And it's not just in Europe. We can see something similar happening in other parts of the world, including the non-Western world. In the world's largest democracy, India, there's some worrying signs there as well. Now, these parties define themselves as nationalist, and unfortunately, they've defined for many others what nationalism means. Their nationalism is largely intolerant and authoritarian. I think a useful description actually for it was given to us by the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, who proudly calls his government illiberal, which is useful for my purposes because we can contrast it nicely with liberal nationalism. Now, if we look at where the support for these parties came from, it didn't come from nowhere, and it wouldn't be fair or accurate just to simply say, okay, all the voters for these parties are extremists or racists. No, their voters have some very real and legitimate concerns, and also, and this is where it's relevant for the liberal nationalism point, they have understandable nationalist feeling, which the likes of Orban and Marine Le Pen and others are exploiting. But this national identity Voters feel that this national identity has been discarded and dismissed, and there is a need to explore a nationalist response to the problem. So what I'm arguing is that the answer to illiberal nationalism isn't to just discard nationalism and say it's just racist and extreme. The answer isn't liberal internationalism or liberal globalism. It's liberal nationalism, and to make clear that nationalism doesn't have to be exclusivist or anti-democratic or xenophobic. And for those of you who were with me last week, and I talked about Zionism coming into being at a time when nationalism, at the start of the 20th century, when nationalism was very much a liberal and progressive movement, right? A movement of national liberation, of bringing people out of the control of empires and giving them freedom in their own nation states. And that's the authentically liberal beginnings, if you like, of nationalism. I want to quote you, I want to cite you a British professor called David Miller at Oxford, who supports the idea of liberal nationalism, and he set out 3 propositions about national identity that I think are quite useful in setting out why nationalism is a legitimate mode of expression. And unfortunately, we have to do that because nationalism has become this dirty word. So first of all, he explains that national identity is a legitimate and natural way of identifying, right? So he says, this is a quote, "A person who in answer to the question, 'Who are you?' says, 'I am Swedish' or 'I'm Italian,' is not saying something that is irrelevant or bizarre," right? He's not saying something that is not a legitimate expression of who they are. Their national identity is a perfectly legitimate way of identifying themselves. Then he says that nations are what he calls ethical communities, meaning a community of people that says we are all here together because we're all Spanish or we're all French or we're all Jewish, is a legitimate community. There's nothing unnatural or unethical and certainly not therefore racist about feeling a particular responsibility to and connection to your fellow citizens or your fellow people. There's a nice quote from the philosopher Kwame Appiah, who says he doesn't have any children of his own, but he talks about his nieces and nephews. And he says, "I have a particular fondness for my nephews and nieces, one that does not extend to your nephews and nieces. Indeed, I believe it would be morally wrong not to favor my relatives when it comes to distributing my limited attention and treasure. Does it follow that I must hate your nephews and nieces? Surely not. It's not that my family matters more than yours. It's just that it matters more to me," right? That subjectively, the subjective kinship that you have with people of your own group. It doesn't mean that they're better. It's not a superiority thing. This is not the xenophobic nationalism of the far right. And the third proposition is that simply that people who form a national community in a particular territory have a good claim to political self-determination, right? This is the nation-state idea that we talked about last week and we'll say a little bit more about today. Now, fast forward to today, to the 21st century, and we're in this world of hyper-individualism and mass communication and social media, and perhaps now there's even more of a need for people to feel they belong, right? To feel that they're anchored somewhere in this globalized world. And not everyone's benefited from globalization. If we look at the twin political surprises of 2016, the British vote to leave the European Union, and then the election of Donald Trump in November, both of those shock results can be at least partly explained by people feeling that they were the losers of globalization, that cheap foreign goods were ruining their businesses, that immigrants were taking their jobs, and without getting too political, and I'm absolutely not in this conversation going to get into the political minefield of taking a position on Brexit or Donald Trump, but I think it is fair to say that the campaigners in both the pro-Brexit campaign and the Donald Trump campaign did a very good job of hyping up those fears and playing to those fears. So that's nationalism. What about liberal nationalism specifically? Firstly, just a word of caution. I also gave this last week. When I say liberal, I don't mean in the American sense of liberal versus conservative, right? Liberal in the broad sense of liberal democracy, of the sort of basic rights that we understand in liberal democracy that we'll talk about later. Now, liberalism and nationalism are more often than not presumed to be opposing ideologies, right? The more nationalist you are, the less liberal you are, and vice versa. And that's I think, a common view today. And liberal nationalism rejects that idea. Liberal nationalists claim, they don't just claim that the two concepts can coexist, they actually say that they should, that liberalism and nationalism are strengthened and give added value to the other one. So Professor Yuli Tamir, Israeli professor, political scientist and former member of Knesset, who wrote her PhD on liberal nationalism, said that the modern nation state is a product of the marriage of liberal democratic and nationalist values, right? That liberal countries worked best, and the people that formed these countries understood. Liberal countries work best when citizens feel a sense of kinship with each other. So the ideal liberal state was a nation state. If you look at something basic like taxation and welfare spending, the concept relies on citizens being willing to hand over some portion of their income to assist fellow citizens that they have never met and will probably never meet, right? So you're far more likely to do that if your fellow citizens are people that you have some sort of connection with. A liberal national state combines a reverence for national symbols, for traditions, for specific national traditions, the traditions of your nation, of your people, with a commitment to liberal democratic principles. And that's important, particularly when we contrast it with the illiberal nationalism that we're opposed to. If take a Hungary or Poland. So what do I mean by liberal democratic principles? Broadly speaking, things like regular, free and fair elections, protections for minority rights anchored in a constitution, or in countries like Israel where there is no constitution, then the basic laws, some equivalent. The rule of law, including, very importantly, an independent judiciary, and of course, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom of the press, and the freedoms that we associate with democratic countries. Now, if we look at Hungary and Poland, these are two member states of the European Union that have moved far, far away from these ideals. In Hungary more than Poland, but getting there in Poland, the courts have been packed with judges loyal to the regimes. Journalists critical of the governments have been fined financial penalties or been fired. Media companies have been bought out by regime loyalists. And most recently in Hungary, Viktor Orban has used the corona crisis to assume virtually dictatorial powers in the parliament. So the polar opposite of what we're talking about. Another way of looking at how liberal nationalism combines the two ideas of liberalism and nationalism is that it recognizes national identity as an important force for communal solidarity, but it encourages an inclusive nationalism, one in which citizens of a country are encouraged to feel part of a shared future with full equality, but united by values rooted in the nation's tradition. And it means that, for example, liberal democracy in Poland won't look exactly like liberal democracy in India. The traditions are different. They'll celebrate different holidays. There'll be differences of emphasis in the way that the societies function. Religion will play a different role in the different countries, and of course different religions. And also the messy compromises that typify how democracies work will be resolved in different ways because they come from different places. But both of them will have free and fair elections. Both of them will observe the rule of law. Both of them will have constitutional protections guaranteeing equal rights for all the citizens. Both will have free speech, free press, etc. And what I want to claim is that this idea of an inclusive nationalism can be a response both to people on the left, people that identify with the left, and people that identify with the right. So if we look at something like identity politics in the United States, which is a very powerful force on the left right now, and it sort of divides citizens into their component social groups based on ethnicity or religion or gender or sexuality. And liberal nationalism tells these people that they don't have to disconnect from their wider national identity in order to achieve equality and justice. If we look at the United States, earlier generations of civil rights activists teach the liberal nationalist lesson quite well. If you can go back 60 years to Martin Luther King, and you can find American national values invoked as the solution to the problem of racism. Yuli Tamir, who I mentioned before, actually describes the famous speech that he gives on the eve of his assassination as, quote, a fine combination of liberal and national values, right? He talks in his humanity as a whole, and he also talks very specifically about America. Or you go back to Frederick Douglass, who fought against slavery 160 years ago, and instead of saying that the Declaration of Independence is a sham because all the guys who signed it owned slaves, that's one way of looking at it, he says, no, America was founded on this great liberal idea of equality, and let's make it real. That should be and can be the heart of an American national identity, which insists on social justice and civil rights. Now, for the right, for right-wing or right-leaning voters, liberal nationalism has something important to say, I think, about immigration and borders and rights and responsibilities. It acknowledges that a nation is a geographically bounded community, and the control of borders is a very real and very legitimate part of national sovereignty. It also says that whilst minorities must be guaranteed equal rights, it also demands from them that they sign up to some of the moral norms of the country. So if we look at Europe, where there has been a real problem of immigrants or refugees from some Muslim countries not always signing up to those moral norms, particularly with regard to attitudes towards women and homosexuality, and unfortunately, maybe inevitably Jews, too often the only politicians that are sounding the alarm about this are the far-right nationalists, the Orbans and the Le Pens, who are claiming to be protecting Western civilization from Islam. They don't mention, of course, that Western civilization also includes precisely those liberal concepts that they reject. But when mainstream politicians from both the centre-right and the centre-left seem to be ignoring that issue because they're scared of being branded racist or Islamophobic, then people turn to the illiberal nationalists. Liberal nationalism, on the other hand, insists on a kind of contract between the nation state and citizens from minority communities. The liberal element means that citizens who are not part of the national majority must receive all the same individual rights and protections as everyone else in the state. And the national element means that there is a national identity which defines the state, and it informs certain values and norms of the society, and all citizens are required to respect those values and norms. Now, I'll just finish with this. I said last week, when I talked about political Zionism, as I said, it came out of this liberal nationalist concept that was emerging in Europe at the time. I mentioned the novel Alt Neuland of Herzl, and also Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who really expressed most comprehensively and with real intellectual vigor the ideas of liberal nationalism. In my essay, I described him as the quintessential liberal nationalist Zionist. And we know what happened later on in the 20th century, right? We know what happened in the 1930s and 1940s when illiberal, racist, expansionist nationalism was dominant in Europe. But that earlier phase of nationalism was liberal in the classical sense. And my argument is that we can fight best against resurgent far-right nationalism or authoritarian nationalism, not by rejecting nationalism itself, but by embracing nationalism's liberal heritage, balancing the rights and freedoms of liberalism with the rootedness of community and respect for tradition that's associated with national identity. And also that it's the most effective manifestation of liberal democracy, that it answers that human need for connection and solidarity while guaranteeing that all citizens have individual rights. Okay, I'm going to finish there. As I said, I wrote in the chat box my email address, the essay on which this talk is based, and also a link to my talk last week, so you can go back and see that and read that, or email me and ask me questions, or tell me that you don't like what I said, as you wish. But now I want to introduce our guest speaker. I'm really very, very privileged to have alongside me, virtually alongside me, actually a couple of miles down the road in Rehavia, Dan Meridor, who was born in Jerusalem in 1947. He's a lawyer by profession. He served as cabinet secretary under Menachem Begin and then Yitzhak Shamir in the early 1980s. And he was elected to the Knesset in 1984, serving as Minister of Justice from 88 to 92, and Minister of Finance from 96 to 97. Subsequently, he's been Minister without portfolio, responsible for national defense and diplomatic strategy, and also Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Intelligence and Atomic Energy. He served in a number of different governments. He served in a number of different Knessets. He's one of Israel's really outstanding public servants, and most relevantly for us, I think he's probably one of the most consistent and reliable sort of torchbearers of the legacy of Menachem Begin and his liberal nationalism. So without further ado, Dan Meridor.
Thank you, Paul, for your polite words. You heard the very impressive description of liberal nationalism by Paul. I commend you for that. It was really interesting to listen. I was asked to speak about liberal nationalism or national liberalism in the context of Menachem Begin and the Zionist movement. To start with a small token, Menachem Begin formed the Likud party. The Likud party, in its official name, as Begin gave it to the party, it's Likud, which means union, a national liberal movement. This, for him, was very important. In a way, I can say it's the genetic code on which he built this party and his worldview. To a large extent, what he learned from Ze'ev Jabotinsky was mentioned here. It is not because he thought that he had to defend himself against somebody. It was a basic philosophy on which I think Zionism was based from almost all sides. And it, as was mentioned, is part of the development in Europe in the 18th, 19th century, or developing of nations. And in a way, the idea was freedom, liberty. The word liberalism comes from liber, libertas in Latin, which means freedom. And there are two freedoms here. One is your personal freedom. I'm free. I was born free, and the state has no business with me unless they showcase why they should have it. And the other is national freedom. My nation wants to be free, not subjugated to other nations. This brought the Spring of Nations in 1848 in Europe, and nations like the Czechs and the Hungarians and the Poles became independent. They were free, libertas. They were liberated, so to speak, from the occupier, from the empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the German, and so forth. And there were nations that were born. So this was the national part, but it's the same freedom in the personal sense. I am free towards my state, towards my country. I don't owe them anything unless they can prove that there's a reason for that. I was born free. I was not born with the commandments from either God or government or anything. Naturally, I'm free. I was born free. This is my liberation. The two liberations go together. And for many people, it really went together to free the nation from the outside occupier or empire or czar or king, and to free myself. I'm free. I'm free, and freedom was the word, and this where national liberalism comes from. But here, there's the rub. You have a state. So what is the role? And you want to be free, but states mean that they have some functions which force you to listen to them and to abide by some rules. So the importance of a state to a nation was well understood and proclaimed by President Wilson when he, in the 14 points after the First World War, spoke of the right of nations to self-determination, national self-determination, for the reason that Paul spoke about. I am Italian, I'm Dutch, I'm Belgian, I have my culture, I have my language, I have my literature, I have my environment. I want to live my own way. And this was basic. It is very human, and not to understand it means not to understand humanity in the way people act. And it's not only not negative, it's normal, it's natural for all of us, for most of us. We are part of a group, we may be part of some groups, but the national identity is quite important to all of us. And nation states are built on this principle, that we have something together. But then we don't accept, and we had history with that nations have a right to live only with their own people and nobody else can be part of that state. That means we have minorities. The idea of a state that has only its own people was the Nazi idea of the purity of the race. Only Germans, nobody is not real German. And some other countries are the same thing. And the world is not built this way, that only people of that nationality lives here, the others live somewhere else. You have some mixtures, not clean, so to speak, racially nation societies. Here comes the idea of rights of the individuals and rights of the group. And in a nation state, there is a nation state. It's the nation to which the state is the expression of their self-determination. But there are people who don't belong to that nation. They are Romanians living in Hungary. They are Ukrainians living in Poland or whatever. And what do you do with them? Here, the whole history of group rights, minority rights has developed from the 19th century, and I don't want to go into that. In comes Zionism. Zionism is a national movement. It has to do with the Jews being defined by themselves, or at least by the Zionists, as a nation, not just a religious group, not just people of certain religion that belong to another nation. There was a philosophy like this, speaking of German Jews, meaning we nationally are Germans, but religiously we are Jews. Zionism said, no, first of all, you can be a member of the Jewish nation. By the way, you can do it whether you are religious or not religious, which is a novelty in Jewish history. You can be totally secular and fully Jewish. Take Theodor Herzl, take Ze'ev Jabotinsky, David Ben-Gurion, Chaim Weizmann, the first and most important leaders of Zionism. They were all fully secular and fully Jewish. This was something very new. But we say we are a nation, and only nations, as was mentioned, are entitled to have self-determination. You don't give it to state, to religions. We are a nation. And that nation, building that nation in the context of the Zionist endeavor, starts in the end of the 19th century all through the first half of the 20th century, was in a way an attempt to revive the national feeling in the Jewish people, and to revive them and bring them back to the national ancestral homeland. You know the story, I don't want to go into it, and it did so with success. So nationalism was very, very important, to teach people to have a flag, to have an anthem, to speak of the nation of Jews and the right of the Jewish nation. What is the problem? The problem is that when you speak of nationalism, it becomes #1 priority, which it may become in the revolutionary era like the one we lived in, or our parents and grandparents lived in. You sometimes forget the individual. If it's all about the nation and the general public and nothing about the individual, it may really turn the priorities upside down. And the upside down, I mean, people are the main target of all of this. States are built for people, not people for states. And states should serve the people, not the other way around. And this has to do with what we call a liberal regime. That means you have certain rights that has to do mainly with freedoms. Again, liberal from libertas, so freedom, which is freedom of speech and freedom of movement and freedom and so forth. And this was in the Zionist idea, it went together. They fought for rights of individuals and groups, for Jews all over the world, who were minorities and individuals, and the national right to have a state of our own. So it went together, there was no contradiction. But there is a question of balance, and this needs to be remembered. By the way, when you grow in years, which I did for some good number of years now, you understand that one flag is always easier to raise and fight for and get everybody enthusiastic about. But wisdom calls for balancing several flags. The French, in the French Revolution, had the 3 flags of liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, and fraternity, so to speak. It's great to fight for liberty, wonderful, and you really can excite everybody. But if you forget equality, you end up with liberty that leaves some people totally unequal to others. We all are the freedom of the nation and so forth, or freedom of people, but somebody is starving to death. Freedom to starve to death. So the idea of balancing the liberal and the national is the, as I said, the genetic code upon which this movement of Jabotinsky and Begin was founded and was active. Because in a way, because we are very sincere and serious and devoted our life to the national part of Jewish life, building a nation, in gathering from the diaspora, national is this thing. It is very, very important that we keep the liberal part, or else we end up on the extreme edge of nationalism. And we saw nationalism being pushed to the edge. I don't want to mention the social nationalism of the Nazis, but take Italy, take nationalism in other countries. In the name of nations, awful crimes have been committed, and people were really not important anymore. You just need to serve the nation. As this, the same thing can be said about the other edge of this equation. The idea that the world is one is fine, and we are all equal is fine. But the thinking that I am a citizen of the world and this suffices, this is enough for me, is not right. What we may see now, and I think Paul mentioned it, is some reaction to the globalization that really made us a global village. There is an element of global village. I speak to you now in English, although my language is Hebrew. And I see films that are shown now in New York or in Johannesburg or in Paris, and we enjoy the same thing. And we live in a common world, and we are citizens of the world. But we are also members of our own community. And how to balance these two things, liberal and national, is the name of the game. How far do we go for that edge, and how far for the other edge? How do we find the balance? It's not very popular. In times of stress, it's easier to go all the way to the national thing, and I'm for my group. I'm a Manchester United fan or a Barca fan or what have you, other groups. I don't care about the others. But if you want to maintain a stable and regime of justice, you need to see the group, but remember it's all about people in the end, the liberal side of it. So it is that, for that reason, when Israel was established, and David Ben-Gurion was the first prime minister, and he read out on the 15th of May, 48, our Declaration of Independence, which has all these values in it. He objected, I think, mistakenly to agreeing on a constitution on the first day or year of Israel. A big mistake, I thought. He had the British example. They don't need a constitution. The British are different. They have tradition of 1,000 years since William the Conqueror, and we don't have that. So we don't have a constitution. How did Israel become a state democracy? And we are a democracy. It was mainly the Supreme Court that introduced those basic values against the government that was very strong in the early 50s. And I don't want to go into that now, but along the years, we have developed the Israeli democracy, including constitutionally by enacting basic laws. I don't want to go all of that. I'm just saying that the Likud party, or its historic mother called the Herut party, the Party of Liberty, which was our party, Begin's party, was the initiator, the protagonist of constitution, of human rights, of respect of the rule of law in the Supreme Court. And this is interesting because in Israel there were many debates, many political debates, many even struggles, not to say fights, over land and peace, that socialism or capitalism, relationship with Germany after the Second World War and so forth. But there's never been a struggle over these basic ideas of the rule of law, of human rights, of democracy. Why is that important? Because a nation that is so, in a way, torn up by very fundamentally important conflicts needs to agree upon the basic values and about the decision-making process. And it was agreed. We all accepted that at the end of the day, we are a democracy, there's a Supreme Court that we abide by, there's Knesset that decides for us. And there was nobody in the Israeli political arena, Israeli body politic, nobody who spoke against those basic values. I have to say now it's the opposite. the basic values that everybody agreed on, at least verbally and officially, now under attack. As in many parts of the world that were mentioned here, if you now speak of democracy, human rights, rule of law, you may be depicted as a leftist. Although these were the words and ideas Menachem Begin spoke of and fought for all his life, and Jabotinsky before it. So something is changing in the world now as a reaction to what we have seen earlier. And let me say this, I believe that after the Second World War, because of the horrors of that war, because of the terrible consequences, not only to us Jews, definitely it was, but for all the world, there was a very positive trend toward what we call liberal democracy, human rights, rule of law, constitution, all the way to the collapse of communism and the spreading of democracy in all sorts of forms, almost all over the world. Not the Arab world, I have to say, unfortunately, but in many parts of the world. And I thought, the liberal democracy camp is winning, all the way until Mr. Fukuyama wrote his article in the New York Times saying, we won it, that's it, the end of history. But we might not have seen the backlash coming in. And now there's a backlash in the recent years, including in my country, but all over the world, away from those basic values that had been so important in balancing the power of states and the individual rights, the national themes and the individual themes, minority right and majority force. This has been very important and very successful. Now these values are under attack. And if I look back at the writings and speaking of people like Jabotinsky and Begin, I never speak in their name. They are dead now for many years and I don't want to do it. I'm not allowed to do it. But I know what they would have said because they said it. We will always keep equal rights. We'll always respect the rule of law. We'll always be democratic. It's not provided that this and that. No, this is the basis. And we are very national in the sense that we care about the Jewish cause. We care about Jews. We want to help Jews, not at the expense of doing wrongs to others. We do right to ourselves. Jews were wronged for so many centuries. We do right for them. We correct this wrong. We did it quite well, trying to minimize the price that others are paying. In a way, Jewishly, I would say this is a moral test. You know, Jews have been in diaspora for practically 2 millennia since the exile by the Romans. And in recent 2 or 3 centuries, Jews have been champions of human rights and democracy all over the world, for blacks in America and South Africa, all over the world. You see the footprint or the handprint of Jews in drafting human rights convention, in fighting for human rights. But this is not a big thing because we are minorities. Of course we are for human rights. Now at long last we are a majority. It is our test, our moral test. How do we treat minorities among us? Whether it's Arab, whether it's foreign workers, whether it's homosexuals and heterosexuals, whether it's women, whether it's other groups, Ethiopians who have different skin color than we. How do we treat minorities? Do we say now, I have the majority, I don't care about minorities? Or do we say what we said we were in diaspora is minority? Yes, we have minority rights, human rights. Democracy is not just about the rule of majority, it's about what majority cannot do to the minorities. What is the right balance, the national liberal balance? Begin was the one most important political figure that had this ideology and promoted it, and all the party went with him. Now, when I look around the Israeli political scene, I don't see that sort of leadership, and the discourse has changed, and it's quite of concern to me. It is of concern because I look around the world and I see these values are not well accepted. Even the term of Mr. Orban of Hungary, illiberal democracy, which to me is an oxymoron in a way. How can you be democracy and not liberal? This is something that we need to look at very, very closely. The damage that can be done by losing the sight of the possible damage that has occurred in the past, losing the sight of the right balance that we need to keep, losing the sight of leadership that needs not to go with the masses, but teach the masses, trying to educate the masses. This is a big challenge to all of us. I think that liberal democracy is the best way that we can think of that takes into account the national feeling, national interest, national culture, what have you, and individual rights, individual identity that is not only very correct in human rights terms, I think it's very Jewish and Jewish tradition. Let me pause here and I give the mic back to Paul and you take it from there.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan Meridor. Okay, there's a couple of points, one sort of point and one question, and maybe there'll be some more questions. There was a gentleman named Groucho, I'm not sure if that's his real name, but we'll call him Groucho because that's what he's called here, points out that Benedict Anderson pointed out that nations were imagined communities, and he says the same goes for the Jewish people, it's all in the eye of the beholder. Maybe Dan wants to say something about that. I'll just say that I actually addressed that in my talk last week when I talked about the Jews as a national movement. So I would recommend that he watch my lecture, which I linked to at the beginning on YouTube. But I don't know if Dan Meridor wants to comment on that, on the Benedict Anderson point.
Well, I would say only this: it's a subjective question in the sense that somebody can say, "I'm Jewish in my religion, but I'm fully German or fully French. I don't see any national feeling toward the Jews with me." It's not my feeling. As a liberal person, I give him the right to say what he thinks. If that's what he feels, he can live whatever he wants to live. I have my judgment on this. I think he's wrong in his understanding of history and what may happen tomorrow. And I can tell you, when I live in Rehavia, I hear a lot of American English and French around me when people felt that it's the right time if they had the money to buy something here. But I'm not threatening. I think if people want to live abroad, they can live abroad. For them, you don't need the Jewish nation or the Jewish state. They think they can live without it, let them live it. I'm not telling them what to do. My understanding, and I represent a large part of the Jewish people, is that we are not only a religion. In fact, religion now divides us sometimes more than unites us because of infighting of reform, conservative, orthodox, and whatnot, and secular. But we are a nation in every sense. We have been an abnormal nation because we had no geographical proximity. But the language I speak is the Hebrew language of Jews all over the place, all over the world, in prayer and now in everyday life. My history is the Jewish history. My literature, my poetry, it's all Hebrew, and this is my people. But I don't force it on anybody else. And maybe there are Jews, not maybe, there are Jews who don't think it. Okay, I have no problem with that. There are people who were Italians and now are Americans, or Irish, now are Americans, and it's fine. Some people live in Dublin that think they belong to the Irish nation. Some of them move to New York or Boston rather and say, we are Americans, we don't belong to the Irish nation anymore. Some of them say, why do you ask me these questions? I want to feel both identities. Even this is all right. As a liberal person, I don't want to force, and I will not force on anybody. I don't have a way to force. I even had it. I wouldn't force on anybody the feeling of belonging to a certain group. There are enough people, millions of people, who feel they're very Jewish. Some of them, unfortunately, under bad circumstances, because they were persecuted, the Jews, and some of them, many of them did not even survive to do it, to say what I'm saying now. But many, many people feel that there's something that unites them more than religious services. This is nation. And the Israel is the nation state of this people. And I think this has nothing to do with the liberal concept that people are free to say they belong here, they belong there, it's all fine.
Okay, thank you very much. I had a request to repost the link to last week's session. I've just done that. Maybe not everyone could see originally, so I just posted the link to last week's session on YouTube. Okay, here's a question from Francine relating to your point about non-Jewish minorities. She says, when has the government of Israel taken the initiative on assisting non-Jewish minorities in the country?
Oh, well, many times. See, I am quite critical about some things in that respect. You might have felt it from my talk, but I have to say, basically, I think the Arabs living in Israel, I don't speak about the territories now, I speak Israel proper. About 20% of us are Israelis and Arabs, fully Israeli, fully Arab. I'm fully Israeli and fully Jewish. The 20% of Arabs, I think, enjoy more freedom than any Arab in any other country. Their standard of living is getting higher and higher. By the way, the Arab Christian community, standard of living, economic standing, education standing is, I think, a bit higher than the average Jewish. The Muslims somewhat less. The Bedouins in the bottom of it, the others are better. But you see the trend is improving and improving. There have been mistakes made here. There was a military government in the areas the Arabs lived in until 1965 for about 15 or 16 years, which was too long and superfluous, and thank God we got rid of it. But basically, there is equality here. The law speaks for equality. Is there enough that we have done? Not. I think we should do more in affirmative action other ways. There still is a big job for politicians who are ready to take the job and educate people. But let's not forget the basic conditions. There was a fight between the Jews and the Arabs on this land. It was a fight in purchasing land. It was a fight for the nations of the world policy. It was a fight of economies. There was a fight of labor. There's a fight in guns and bombs and terror, whatnot. And in the end, I wouldn't say thank God, thanks to the people who were here in 1948, we won. And I'm happy we won. Had we not won, we wouldn't have spoken it today. But I think in winning, it wasn't easy to say, okay, we forgot everything. Everything is fine. The Arabs all accept and they won't be subversive and so forth. I think the fact that after 72 years since the War of Independence, the very, very small number of Arabs who were accused of or charged with or convicted of treason or acts of terror, speak of Israeli Arabs, not the territories, is exemplary. That we have succeeded in that. And in spite of the fact that it was against the intuition, Jews against Arabs fighting, yes, now there's a change, a major change in May 48. Not anymore communities fighting, people fighting one against the other. Now we are a state, not a Jewish community. We're a state of all our citizens. We as a majority, the Jews in the country, need to treat the minorities equally and even more if we can do that. I think basically we have done it. The governments just recently, even the present government, I don't support them now, but have given a lot of money, billions of shkalim, to improve the infrastructure and other things in the Arab communities. I think you can see it all around. It is much better. Still, the conflict is not solved. And if you ask me, what is the feeling of an Israeli Arab when Jews fight Arabs in some incident? I don't know. I don't even ask him. What I'm interested in is that he abides by the law. And I think 95% or more of them do abide by the law. So there is an ongoing effort that needs to be taken by the government to improve the relationship. Unfortunately, if you look at the discourse, the political discourse, in many countries, rather than talking on the issues, people speak of identity. America first, those Mexicans, those blacks, those this, those that. I don't want to go, the foreign workers, the Gastarbeiter in Germany. And in Israel, some politicians, without mentioning names, but you can guess them, start to speak about the Jews against the Arabs and the basic law of the state of Israel that was passed recently was totally superfluous, saying we are a Jewish state, right, but why don't you write in that there's equality? There were mistakes done here. And the discourse of identifying yourselves by who you are not, I'm not an Arab, is very profitable politically, shamefully. So we see this discourse, and I think it's wrong and it's dangerous, and we need to fight against it. And I see it, as I said, all over the world. I remember in Hungary, it was mentioned here, Mr. Orban. I met him. I was in Hungary, met him still in my official capacity in the Israeli government. I don't want to speak too much, but he had a campaign against non-NGOs, non-governmental organizations that fought for human rights. The way he said it is he passed 3 laws and he called them anti-Soros laws. Soros is a Hungarian Jew who made his way to the West and became a very wealthy man. But it's not by coincidence they call it anti-Soros, because he's Jewish, he's not really Hungarian. This is what is implied here. And this is dangerous. to use the hate to the other, to the foreigner, to the one who is not us, by identifying who you are, not the good things that you do, but what you are not. This we should avoid in Israel, because we are a state of the Jews and all the citizens. It's a Jewish state in the sense that the Jewish self-determination is expressed here, but it's a state of all the citizens at the same time. There's no contradiction. And this has changed recently and needs to be corrected.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, now the questions are coming thick and fast. All right, this one from Sarah Himalas brings us up to date with current affairs. She says, Begin famously said, "You annex foreign land, not your own country." What was Begin's attitude towards annexation, and how did that reflect his liberal nationalist ideology? Obviously, a reference to what's going on right now in the news.
Begin believed, as we believe, I believe, that this land of Israel is not foreign land to us. It's a land we lived in. We created here our kings, our prophets. The Bible was written here. We were expelled from. We have a right to come back to. And this is the basis of Zionism, but it was not the only basis. We never said, and Begin never said, we have a right because this is history, and we rule because of the right. They always said another thing. We rule by majority. So when we build a state, we need to have a vast Jewish majority, or else we cannot rule it. The right may be there. It's not exercised if we don't have majority. And not only this, when we are there, we'll keep human rights and equality to all of us for the reasons I mentioned earlier. So when it came to land, which Begin saw evidently is historic Jewish land, he made big concessions to get peace. He was the one who made peace with Egypt, breaking the unbreakable, so people thought, unbreakable unity of the Arab countries against Israel, and began peace in the Middle East and stability by giving away all of Sinai, 2.5 times Israel. It was very hard. Many people in our own party objected, but he was not a leader that goes to the polls to ask what the people want, but he said what is right and moved there. So this is one thing about land. About the land of Israel, that is to say Judea and Samaria, and that Gaza in the same way, he offered something at Camp David, which you can read in the Knesset Protocol of 77. He said, this is our land, we have a right to it, and we claim it. When there are other claims, he didn't say right. Jordan and Egypt, the PLO was not relevant there. If I want peace, this is my offer. Let's leave the question of sovereignty open. I don't apply my sovereignty, you don't apply. Let's deal with the people. And he offered autonomy. And then he says, but what about voting? The people there, Arabs, will have to choose. They want to be state Jordanian, let us say Jordanian, vote to Jordanian parliament. They want to become Israelis, they can become Israelis. And he said, we don't want to be Rhodesia or South Africa. Because for him, you can annex land that you think is yours and have a right to, only if you liberate not only the land, but the people. The people are equal and they can become your citizen. Otherwise, you can't do that. The problem with the proposition of today, of the what they call the Trump plan or the post-failure Trump plan for the annexation, I don't know what will come out of it, but is that they want to find a trick to annex the land, but not give a writing vote to Palestinians, by not annexing the Palestinian enclaves. This is very wrong. It's a tough balancing act to make. You want to have all the land, you need to give everybody equal rights. Will you have a Jewish majority? Will it be a Jewish nation state? You want to give up part of the land? It's very painful. It's not foreign land to me. It's the land I feel very attached to, but it's not only the biblical figures I see. I see the Arabs who live there now. So Begin always said, when we do that in terms of annexation, of the word annexation he wouldn't use, he said applying our sovereignty because it's not foreign land to us, we will liberate the people. They'll have a right to become Israelis if they so choose. By the way, Ben-Gurion in 49, when the War of Independence ended and we had more land that were planned for us in the UN partition plan, he forced upon all Arabs and Jews Israeli citizenship. He gave them equal rights from day one. When we annexed, so to speak, or applied the sovereignty to Jerusalem after 1967, every Arab in Jerusalem was immediately automatically given inhabitants' right, and was given a choice. If you want to become Israeli, you can apply to become Israeli. the big part didn't take because Jordan and the PLO objected to it. Some did take it. When we annexed the Golan Heights in 81 under Begin, every Druze guy, everybody on the Golan Heights was given the option to become Israeli. Some took, some didn't. Syria was objecting, they were afraid, but the option has to be given. You can't annex a land and leave the people without participating. What you call in the American Constitution, American Declaration of Independence, the consent of the governed. You need people to have a right to decide about their lives, to vote about their lives. So I don't know what Begin would have done today. He's not here with us, but definitely he would never agree to liberate land and not liberate the people with it. You want to take land into Israel, if you can do it politically and it works, right, but everybody there should have equal rights with the Jews. If the numbers play for you, all right, do it. If they don't, a big question mark is left open.
Wonderful. Okay. We have, I think, time for maybe one more question. Melvin Lipich, who asks, what was Begin's attitude to accusations of dual loyalty to Jews living in the diaspora? And what would you speculate on this issue with Jews that presently have dual loyalty?
Well, this is a sensitive question, touchy one. I don't have dual loyalty. I'm all Israeli and all Jewish. I have no problem with that. I think that people can live in other states, like the United States or England or France or whatever, and live with that they have a loyalty to the state they live in. They're citizens of the United States or England or Britain, that is, or France, and that's fine. And they have very close attraction to Israel. Family attraction, cultural attraction, historical attraction, religious attraction. There shouldn't be a conflict. There shouldn't be a conflict. There shouldn't be a conflict because many of us belong to many circles. We are not only one thing. I'm an Israeli, I'm a Jew, I love classical music, I'm a fan of football team, I'm many things. I'm either gay or heterosexual, I'm all sorts of things. And there shouldn't be a conflict. If we come to a situation where Israel, God forbid, fights the other state, and you are a citizen of that state, is a problem there. By the way, when the question of service in the military for the Arabs came, Begin said, don't do that, give them exemption. I don't want them to be in the situation we were in, where Jews in Poland had to fight Jews in the Russian army or the German army, because still they have their Jewish feeling or their community feeling or their religious feeling, and you don't need to put them, or you need not to put them, in a position they have to fight their own brethren or family or so forth. So you take into account the state interest, the national interest, and the individual interest. Again, the liberal national approach. And Begin definitely would say it, and did say it, about the citizenship of Israelis. Of course, as a Zionist, he would see as normal that Jews come to Israel, normalization of Jewish people. But as I said earlier, people all over the world can travel now. Before the COVID-19, you could travel openly, and people go from Israel to England or from England to Israel, and it's not a static world. And people can live here and there. I always see people coming to Israel as Olim, coming up to Israel, and going from Israel as Yodim, going down from Israel, because to me, Israel is the epicenter of Jewish history, and this where Jews, I think, who care about Judaism should live. But it's my perception, my position. If Jews think otherwise, I don't think there should be a problem of dual loyalty. More than any other group, Italians Americans or Irish Americans or British who came from Belgium or from Poland, people are not made of one stuff. They're made of complex identities, and I don't see a problem with it. Shouldn't be a problem with it.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Dan Meridor. Thank you for joining us today. I got one message just sent to me by Marcel Danon in South Africa, who's actually a friend and a supporter of us here at the Begin Center, who said, with your permission, Marcel, I'll read out what you said to me, that it's a brilliant expose of accurate liberal revisionist Zionism, so badly misunderstood today. And I think that's absolutely right. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. As I said, this is the last of these 4 lectures. A special big thank you to those of you who've been with me for all 4 of these. We're actually continuing with some English programming next Wednesday. We're restarting our Mr. Prime Minister series, where we look at a different Prime Minister each week. Next week, we're actually looking at Menachem Begin, and we have with us the wonderful Daniel Gordis to do that for us. So you'll receive a link to that, those of you on this call. You can also get it from the website. You can email me, paulg@begincenter.org.il.
Paul, let me intervene with a joke for you, a story, funny story.
Go for it.
You know, the Prime Minister was a series. I think the producer was Mr. Jonathan Lynn, was the nephew of Abba Ibn, our foreign minister. Yeah, and one day, and I used to be secretary of the cabinet, and Abba Ibn gave me, I still have it at home, the book of Yes Prime Minister, and he dedicated to me and said to the Israeli Sir Humphrey, because he thought I was that sort of a person as the secretary of the cabinet. So it was funny, and this will just as a joke after what you are going to listen to and hear, see next time. But it's a beautiful series.
Yeah, when we started this series of Mr. Prime Minister, we were just translating from the Hebrew, because we did a series in Hebrew, Adoni Rosh Memshalah, we just translated to Mr. Prime Minister, and a lot of people here thought it was just called Yes Prime Minister. So maybe that would be more entertaining. But anyway, thank you everyone very much. Thank you, Dan Meridor, again, and good evening, good morning, good afternoon.
Good evening.
Bye.